Hello, class. I just wanted to wrap up our discussion of Paradise Lost. I want to keep it in line with the overall theme of the class, examining monsters and their purpose and what makes them not so monstrous. So I'm going to focus this part of the lecture on the various demons and whatnot here in Paradise Lost, just because it fits into the theme of the class, and I think a close examination of them um, has some interesting insights. I will also make some announcements at the end of this lecture regarding the class, so stay tuned for that. And, well, I guess we can just go forward then. So I'm focusing on fitting in this class, the general monster theme here in Paradise Lost, with examination of the monstrosities we have, and uh, there's kind of like a reverse thing that happens. The more uh, good you claim something is, the more its hypocrisies and bad sticks out. And the opposite seems to be true here in Paradise Lost. When we try to show the badness of various characters, there's some things that peek out as relatable. Uh, so Satan, obviously, his main sin is pride. Here I have this one little quote: "Whom I now, of force, believe almighty, since no less than such could have overpowered such force as ours." So this really captures one main part of Satan's character. The only reason he knows God as Almighty is because God beat him, and I think it's saying there's no shame in getting beaten by the best. Uh, he had to be so good in order to beat us because we're real good. I know how good I am. This is a sort of circular reasoning, a rationalization of things after the fact, but it really gets to, uh, I don't know, the smallness of such a character, the narcissism, the egocentrism. Uh, it's one of those really in-depth characterizations just because of, well, I mean, it's one of those showing, not telling, that characterization that really captures the self-centeredness and pride of Satan. And so he also acts out of spite, which is one I show from this next quote here. "If then his providence out of our evil seeks to bring forth good, our labor must be to pervert that end, and out of good still find means of evil." So really, he's defining himself kind of like the Joker does with Batman, uh, by being the opposite of what uh, the Almighty God intends. Excuse me. It's not coincidental that he says something like pervert. And so there's that saying we come to in the class quite a bit. Why does bad stuff happen? Or, wait, what is it? Give me a second. Um, there's everything happens for a reason, I guess. And here, so he's saying that he knows this somewhat, that there is a reason behind everything that's not so apparent to us as we're going through it, but you have to usually go through it and learn the lessons of life in order to make sense of things. And so automatically we have Satan shooting down that possibility, saying, no, we're not going to try and find that good lesson. We're not going to try and learn our lessons. We're not going to stop fighting. We're going to just twist everything to evil. So this kind of pettiness, again, I think humanizes Satan in the sense that we've all, you know, acted out of spite, acted angrily in response to like defeat or jealousy or whatever. And we don't do it for no good purpose, uh, but we hardly act on it. As relatable and admirable as he does, what is pushing Satan to be so evil? Not evil. That's the wrong way of saying it. But what is pushing Satan is his desire to replace God as the one who's in charge of everything. But he's so crippled by his, own flaws that he's never going to win necessarily. But and he's just dedicated to twisting things. But it becomes difficult because when we have all that, like, not necessarily relatable badness, we also have some other stuff. Look at what he describes with this quote: "One who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make heaven of hell or hell of heaven. What be all but less than he whom thunder hath made greater? Here at least we shall be free. The Almighty hath not built. Here for his envy will not drive us hence. Here we may reign secure, and in my choice to reign with this ambition in hell, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." So we got to one of the classic lines, and it's difficult because uh, it's similar sentiment to, like, would you rather live on your feet or die on your knees? Do you want to be in charge of your life and struggle, or do you want to, be well taken care of but not be in charge? Do you want to live in that cage of gold? Do you? And if we made it more relatable and personable, think of, like, marrying for money, or giving up and always having to ask someone else for permission, even if they're giving you really nice things, and even if they never tell you no, there's still that, gatekeeping that is unbearable. So this is where he becomes admirable in the story, and that he does not want to be constrained, that he wants to have his own freedom. And I mean, a lot of things is perspective and how you react to life. And so maybe this is rationalization on behalf of, flawed individuals. But I mean, come on, we have it's it, I don't want to say slippery slope, but it's difficult to be totally condemnatory of this idea. And obviously, they rebel against the monarchy of God in heaven, and even though Satan's going to do what he wants to do, he puts to vote among his other rebel angels what they decide to do. And they have a debate and discussion. And this partly does make fun of, I guess, burgeoning ideas of democracy, limitations of it, of rational thought and moral relativism. But at the same time, this value has become especially prominent. And so, with the insistence on personal freedom and making one's own way, as well as this reliance on demonocracy, it makes it complicates the figure of Satan. So the first of Satan's rebel angels is Beelzebub, and this is his second in command, and also it's referred to as, like, one of the triumvirate rulers of hell. Beelzebub is also a prominent name and figure whenever people are, writing about various devils or Satans or whatever. Beelzebub is one of them. He's known as the Lord of the Flies just because he's associated with carrion and vermin. Uh, this is, of course, his the what William Golding book, Lord of the Flies, refers back to him. Uh, and it's just a pretty classic figure, uh, who, like many of these demons, and it's kind of like analogized, or not analogized, like representing the idea that they're fallen angels. He can also be characterized as a pagan or Philistine or other kind of god figure. Uh, excuse me. And so, he's ride or die for Satan, and we have that in the first reference in book one. And weltering by his side, on next to himself in power, next in crime, long after known in Palestine, named Beelzebub. So this kind of breaks away from a little bit of the, I guess, what's it, blank verse, because it gets kind of poetic sounding there. But even though Lucifer, now Satan, is the main character, or rather the main antagonist towards God, or protagonist, depending on how you're looking at, he couldn't have rebelled unless he was acting, you know, he had good allies, and Beelzebub is that person. Uh, and so when he's mentioned next, later on, which when Beelzebub perceived, then whom Satan accept none higher sat grave aspect. He rose, and in his rising seemed a pillar of state. Deep in his front engraven deliberation sat in public care, and princely counsel in his face yet shone. Majestic though ruin, sage he stood, with Atlantean shoulders fit to bear the weight of the mightiest monarchies. His look drew audience and attention as still as night, or summer's noontide air, while thus he spake. So again, this is, thus he spake reminds me of Thus Spake Zarathustra, which is, I don't know if any pro wrestling fans with the name of that Wagner piece that Ric Flair comes out to. So I think that's a little bit of an allusion later on. And so these are truly impressive figures. After their fall, after they've been in hell, they right now get free from the pits, the fiery pits there. They still retain something of that nobility. And again, this is confounding because that's an admirable thing. Like, I think it goes back to the classic work of American literature, Batman. And what do you say? Why do we get knocked down so we can see how we can climb back up? It's only a loss if you stay down. And so, even though the course of hell and being twisted and corrupt angels, making them seem like twisted, ugly, corrupt figures, as depicted like in the picture I have here, uh, there's some kind of nobility in maintaining one's dignity in the face of it. It's easy to be knocked down, but think of, I don't know if any of y'all watch like Game of Thrones, where Cersei Lannister has to go through her walk of shame and have her head shaven and whatever, and she's penitently going through the town naked and facing the profanity and barbs and literal like crap getting thrown on her by all the people, and it does break her, but she emerges from that and becomes queen herself again. And this, if it's in any other context, a dethroned noble climbing back up to some kind of power, in this case being number three in the grand scale of things. Let's put God at number one, Satan number two, and now Beelzebub equal to Satan perhaps, but choosing to support him as opposed to be his own way. Somewhat more having what Satan doesn't have, loyalty. That's kind of admirable. In some traditions, though, Beelzebub is also known as Mammon, which we'll get to in just a bit. All right, next up we have Moloch, the Sceptered King. Again, another figure who is, well, I don't want to say I have this totally original theory, but he's interesting in the fact that he's also not just a demon, but one of those, pagan ancient deities worshipped in the past by enemies of the majority culture or the dominant culture. So in the case of Moloch, he's one of those seen as, both I believe the Philistines from the Bible, or even Carthaginians. Uh, the Carthage being right now Tunis, and I bring that up just because we read the Tempest, and that's where the daughter of the king Alfonso, I believe his name was princess of and married into. But anyway, in North Africa on the Mediterranean, on the coast there, not too far from Italy or Rome or whatever, was formerly known as Carthage, and it was Rome's main enemy. And so, consequently, when you're like the main enemy of the dominant culture in the time period, you're portrayed as really evil. And so, part of what was said in their worship of Moloch was child sacrifice and sacred prostitution, holy prostitution at the temples. You would purchase those services at a temple, and that would count also as donations. Uh, and uh, like again, most of our cultural history derives from ancient Rome, the one who was most threatened by this other foreign power. And so you have to think, are they really that bad? It kind of like how we're having now. On one hand, our main antagonists are Russia or perhaps China. And so we are suspicious when they report stuff like, what are they covering up? What is the real truth? But again, they view us the same way. You know, when we report something, what are we covering up with our news and that sort of stuff? So I'm not like denigrating or saying any of this is allowable, but it's like kind of like a massive maybe disinformation or smear campaign. But anyway, Moloch, as presented in Paradise Lost, uh, wants to keep fighting. He's highlighting that very human stubbornness of when is something a lost cause? When do you give up? Do you keep fighting and have like that never give up, John Cena type approach to life, which in some ways is admirable? At what point is it just, wasting your strength, your energy, your blood, the blood of your fellow soldiers? Uh, and so this is a very human struggle because I think, again, I refer back to Batman. It's always darkest before the dawn. Sometimes, especially now when we're all locked in our homes, and it's only been what, like 2 weeks since this thing has really been going on. The current uh, shelter in place type orders will not be lifted until the end of this next coming month. And as we've been talking about during the whole semester, 2020 has really been a heavy year with lots of stuff happening nonstop. I shudder to think of what's coming next. Obviously, the right approach to all this is to not give up. Keep going, keep positive, keep living, keep striving to find meaning and value in life any way you can. But at one point, will it just seem lost? So this becomes both humanizing in the sense that it's something we can relate to, not just because it's an admirable trait, but also when it becomes a deep flaw. Now, one literary theory you can do is like a Freudian kind of psychological reading of things. You want to be careful with this because you don't want to necessarily be ableist in your language. Uh, but what I mean by that is, obviously, a lot of literature predates modern psychological science and medicine, theory and whatnot. And so, in the description of Moloch, uh, I kind of see something that's on the lines of like bipolar disorder or manic depressive nature. He stood up, the strongest and fiercest spirit that fought in heaven, now fiercer by despair. His trust was with the eternal to be deemed equal in strength and rather than be less. So, you know, uh, he's the strongest fighter. Anything can happen. Let's not give up. Let's keep going at it. And one pathology of this condition is like when you're in that manic phase, you seem unstoppable. You're signing up for all types of new projects and challenges. You can conquer the world. And when reality hits you in the face and stops you, or you don't get your way, or you come down from that, it just, you spiral into not being able to handle things, losing control of yourself, and eventually doubling down and just seeing everything against you and pushing back as it going your own way. And so I just thought it was interesting that usually in the past, demon possession was what was labeled as various psychological ailments. And here we have a description of a character who seems uh, quite similar to one of those very valid and real conditions that people must struggle with and consequently overcome and live with. Uh, so I don't mean to demonize them at all for that. That itself becomes admirable. And like I said, there's just a lot of interpretation of the things. So partly in line with what we discussed previously with the Canterbury Tales, I think it's always interesting when you have a back and forth between characters. And so in this case, like we did with the various tales of love at the beginning and throughout all of Canterbury Tales, we have, in this debate between the demons and Satan and what to do, whether to continue the war or whatever, we have Belial, also known as the Wicked, seen as a generally worthless figure, arguing for peace and his rationale being quite a solid one. It can always get worse. Uh, if we get into like, I don't know if it's cosmology or demonology or even theology, but they're still they still exist there in hell. They were kicked out of heaven. Uh, I think we touched upon this in class a little bit, referring to that Bruno Mars song that I don't really like, but maybe you do, and that's okay. Uh, What's worse, to always be seeking heaven or to have it and lose it? And this is again like better to have loved and lost or never love at all. And this is if you become obsessed with seeking heaven and you neglect finding stuff that's still pretty good or making it here, heaven around you, there's all kinds of variations of that question. And so Belial reflects an opposite kind of thing of like, well, no, it can always get worse. You know, they can be probably like obliterated or totally destroyed. And so he's arguing for, well, let's just make the most of our situation here. Referring back to a little bit, and we'll get into this more with the next guy, but Satan's original request, the mind can make a heaven of hell or hell of heaven. And kind of that's what Satan did when he refused to just be satisfied. And that's another human characteristic that, again, all the demons kind of represent. I mean, again, how much do we want to hurry up and get home from class every day, you know? And now we've just been at home the past 2 weeks because of these bordering on quarantine, social distancing, shelter at home, whatever you want to call it, where we're at. And now what? We're here, we're surrounded by our video games and phones or whatever, or, you know, free from responsibility or comfortable beds or whatever. And what do we want? We want to escape and go do whatever we can. So it's kind of like a grass is greener situation, eminently. And again, I'm not saying we should be grateful or whatever. It's just it's very easy to take stuff for granted, even for whatever reason. And so, to some degree, that's kind of obviously what Satan is doing when he wants to take control of everything and dethrone God. And, well, you know, we have someone like Bilal saying, you know, let's just cut our losses and stop fighting with them. Let them do their own thing, and we'll do our own thing as well. Uh, and he is highlighting like a certain form of like debate that is kind of like pointless. Like people who talk about highly theoretical or complex ideas that sound really impressive and smart, but don't connect. We're currently having like a political fallout of that because, at least with like the Trump presidency, right? What's his main selling point? He's an outsider. He a lot of his supporters relate to him because he doesn't, you know, he doesn't use very complex language. There's a lot more that can go in there, and I'll just refrain from that for now. But uh, so here we kind of have, I think, because obviously this to some degree predates democracy in America quite a bit, but uh, Milton was very much critical of power and kingdoms or whatever, but uh, like academic, intellectual discussion can also have a certain hollowness that is free from personal experience. Like there's a even though it's there's always a conflict between, you know, street smarts and book smarts, even though like intelligence and wisdom, even though, you know, they're not too far a gulf between them. But how he describes Belial. Thus Belial, with words clothed in reason's garb, counseling noble ease and peaceful sloth. So again, we have another direct reference to some kind of one of the seven deadly sins. But if it if not acting out of spite, he's still like kind of not like he doesn't want to keep fighting. So he's still dressing up his language, and so it's kind of like a silly, almost parody of this idea of debate, since none of y'all watch. Probably, I could be wrong, but no one really likes watching like congressional hearings and stuff like that, unless it's about something that's relevant to them and their interest directly. Just because that's pretty dry, and even now, debate competitions and forensics, the rules of winning are not the same as being right or correct or whatever. And that's embodied by this character of Belial with his empty promises and words. So next up we have Memon. because he doesn't want to give up his fight. He's gotten free from heaven's tyranny, although it's not really tyranny, but it kind of is. I guess let's consider that part. We have the ruler who's all knowing, all seeing, all wise, and who sets forth directives for how we should act, but lets us decide if we want to follow through on that or not. And so, I mean, our parents know what's best for us, but at the same time, we kind of struggle with their directive and their guidance because we're trying to establish our own individuality. These demons, to some degree, in their defiance and disobedience, become lasting characters, uh, become more personalized than those uh, obedient, subservient angels, although they are still subservient and obedient, or subordinate to Satan. So they kind of, do they have true freedom, or do they just trade one set of chains for another? And so we have Memon, who has broken free, and he doesn't want to back down. He doesn't want to bow down, and he's kind of like a midway point between Moloch and Belial. He doesn't want to make he doesn't want to reconnect with them. He doesn't want to ever fall back under anyone's power, but he doesn't want to necessarily make. He doesn't want to keep. He'll be defiant, but maybe not resistant. He wants to, now that they're in their own place, pandemonium or hell, he wants to uh, make the most out of his bad situation, which again is generally good life advice. Don't focus on what's perfect. I think in writing, I have a saying that I try and tell my students. It's not my saying, obviously, but uh, don't let perfect be the opponent of progress. And so that is, if you try to get something perfect out the gate, you're going to fail. Uh, it takes practice to make perfect, obviously, or whatever platitudes I have. So be willing to fail, be willing to chip away at it. And as you're writing something, don't just try and expect to be great the first time. Just make it better. Nothing's written well; it's all rewritten well. Uh, and so here we have the quote referring back to Memon: "Choose to reside his glory unobscured, and with the majesty of darkness sound covers his throne, from whence deep thunders roar. Mustering rage in heaven resembles hell. As he our darkness, cannot we his light imitate when we please? This desert soil wants not her hidden luster, gems and gold." So, uh, if I were to like do another kind of image of Memon, it would be the golden calf from the story of Moses and 40 days in the desert after leaving Egypt. He is very much concerned with whatever spoils and treasures and whatnot exists there in hell, and if not, he can like get them from heaven, not heaven, and from earth or whatever. And he just wants to build up around them a better place, and so he's taking to heart more, rather than perverting the good that God would try and set in motion because of this. Make a heaven of hell, and that might also be perverting that divine directive as well, because uh, it kind of defeats the purpose of your sending if you want to try and punish someone and they end up liking it or whatever. Of course, a lot of people wrongly view prison as uh, an example of this, just because people have shelter and food, and if they're not in prison, they have to work for that. But again, that's just ridiculous. So don't go with that at all. Lastly, of what I'll cover with this lecture are just the children of Satan, totally a metal or biker gang, like the Rebel Angels would be. But this is more straightforward in its interpretation. Uh, we have a little bit of victimization of the feminine here, but I'll get to that in a bit. The children of Satan, born from his defiance, are death and sin. and this is a pretty straightforward religious viewing of that defiance to God created the thing that is now threatening us in the form of COVID 19, disease and death, as well as sin, which is, twisting our, beautiful desires of love and taking pride in a good day, in a good accomplishment to like lust or sex or too much pride. And so, again, this is kind of like a retelling of Genesis. Adam and Eve's folly made men toil and birthed into that, and so these are what happens when you follow or whatever Satan. And uh, I mean, I don't see too much or near as much depth to these things. They are, at least, uh, sin being victimized by her children, those wolves that she had given birth to. Like again, this is like tormenting and the feminine, which was Shakespeare had been guilty of and Chaucer had been guilty of as well. Uh, and I think of poor Milton's daughters who had to listen to him dictate his story and have to carefully make sure that everything was perfect or whatever. Uh, but again, I think here we have the first, like with a lot, like I mentioned early on, Paradise Lost fits in with Dante's Inferno as some of the places where we get our modern view of like angels and heaven and hell and the stuff that's not directly in the Bible. And so these two figures here, totally not novel original. I mean, they're certainly with Death, the Reaper, Psychocomp, or even Charon, the boatsman, the ferryman who, would take the coins from the dead person's eyes and take them to the underworld across River Styx. And sin is just what's it, a gorgon, like Medusa or a Hydra, a snake person. And that's very much in line with, again, we know the eventual fate of Satan being the serpent, all of them being forced to crawl on the ground or whatnot. Uh, she's half snake, half woman, so maybe a little foreshadowing of what would happen with Eve later on as well to damn Adam. But that's giving Adam too much credit, as it were. So I just wanted to wrap up this lecture just to restate overall what I was going for. If I was to make a general sort of thesis, I would say it'd be close to like something like, even though they're all irredeemably evil, each of the characters present some aspect of human flaws, and this makes them very much relatable and understandable. Definitely, other characters in Paradise Lost have these aspects about them. Even God, as one of when we mentioned this in class, how's it feel when someone in your life is always right about something and they're always telling you, and you just always mess up at some point? Your defiance, for defiance sake, seems justified, but then you fall on your face and you have to deal with them. Hopefully, not saying "I told you so," but sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So even then, that makes them like a relatable human figure, even though that is, the Almighty. Uh, Again, this class was just centered around monsters in literature, and so that's why I wanted to focus on the demons here, just because I'm also a fan of horror, and untold references are made to this in other works that capture this sort of thing. And well, we also want to protect ourselves from these influences. Like I said, the alternate reality version of this class is defense against monsters, and I already taught y'all about how to protect yourselves against fairies and whatnot, so now we know how to protect ourselves against demons. They'll come at you with honeyed words and empty promises which won't work out. And remember the basic rationale for not dealing with these figures. If a demon is powerful enough to not be controlled, it's not worth making deals with because they'll control you. and if it's weak enough to not be weak enough to be controlled, well, then it's not powerful enough to give you more power than you already have. So, literally, there's despite what some people might say, if they just looked at a casual glance of this lesson and try to accuse me of certain things or not, leading you all astray, it's very much anti-trucking with demons. So I hope you did enjoy this, and I have a few notes that we'll get to. Um, so let me just think if there's anything else I want to say with it. But anyway, I think that's that. All right, now that we got all that done, I just want to go over some uh, minor housekeeping things. Next week, go ahead and read, well, for next week, read Frankenstein Volume 1, and after that, the following week, Volumes 2 and 3. And midway through those weeks, you'll have to have your discussion stuff posted for it, so don't fall behind on that. Your journals are due in a few days for Tempest and Paradise Lost. Hopefully you hadn't fallen behind with those, but get those in and I will update your grades accordingly. Frankenstein's journals will be April 17th. And I just want to say a few things on the literary analysis, which itself is due in about a week for the final draft. Send me a rough draft or pre-writing or something if you haven't already. I've read over those that I have received, and for the most part I've been pretty impressed and happy with it. There's just two comments I'd like to zero in on. One, be careful about summarizing too much of the story. You'll want to be bringing up little snippets from the story, little quotes, little paraphrases, little summaries, and the majority of your paragraphs should be analysis, reaction, reflection, thoughts on what you're pointing out, what you think it means. And a lot of you are certainly capable of that. So, don't try and pad the length by just retelling me stories I already know, not in poetic form. The other thing is a little slightly worrisome. A lot of y'all have been doing stuff based off stories discussed in class, and as long as you bring up stuff that we're not covering or that I didn't specifically say to you, you can explore those ideas and present new viewpoints and whatever. That novelty is a bit of a challenge, but it's valid. But just don't repeat back to me what I told you, and especially if the majority of your stuff is what we've already covered in class, try and sprinkle in some outside stuff, preferably other works of literature, but you can refer to other types of stories as well to do your analysis for that. So I think that about covers everything I wanted to say. I'll try to do this a little more interactive or better or whatever. Like I mentioned, just feeling a little sick the past few days, and so I am leaning on a pretty straightforward PowerPoint to do this. But I do miss y'all. I am bummed out mainly that we're not going to get to finish the semester in class. I was very much enjoying class. Maybe I was enjoying it too much. But y'all are all really intelligent and really great students with bright futures ahead of you, and I just wish I could have had your attention and, comments and the real insightful stuff you're doing on the literature. And I know this is not ideal, especially for a lot of y'all senior years too, but we're living through history, and, this is one of those things we're going to be telling stories about decades from now. And hopefully some of that would be how much you enjoyed your literature class, because certainly y'all have made this semester for me memorable, and I'll try to do my best to make the class itself and what remains of it worth your time and attention. So thank you for continuing to be working at it. I know you don't have a lot of choices if you're stuck inside. And shout out to those of y'all who are working at the supermarkets. Y'all are the real troops right now. And if there's any situation that occurs internet-wise, work-wise, health-wise, hopefully not, but keep me in the loop, reach out to me, and I'll try to, adjust as best I can, since I'm trying to, be here for you and make things go successfully. Stay in touch. I'm on Pronto if you want to get in contact with me pronto, and hope you enjoy the lesson.